Hello everyone, today we talk about something a bit different from the usual, that is, how to write a good article, right? And I thought of speaking about this because I presume that many of you are history students, or you're interested in studying history at some point of your life, or you may simply be interested in general to know how certain mechanisms work in the universities, but also in general in the world of publications, of publishing. And telling the truth, I don't think I'm the best person to give an advice in this regard, because I wrote my share of things, but not so much. As you know, I am basically at the very last moment of my it's difficult to say, universities are the first step of the academic career. That has absorbed me a lot. In this year I should be hopefully concluding my final work. It took me 3 years in the PhD, and I don't know how this thing will go. Hopefully, it will serve to something. This is the purpose of it, and I hope that when I will be done with this, I also make actually a series that explains how to write a PhD proper, which is a big thing, like just at an organizational level. I mean, most of the problems I realized with I think with education, but also with work, with jobs in general, it derive sometimes for the people who begin, or at the very beginning, of practically not knowing what the whole thing is about, really, and listening to other people telling them sometimes even contradictory stuff that do not help them at all. And I don't even know why this actually happens, why people sometimes have prejudices and opinions that can be misleading, right? There is a general discouragement that I feel, at least where I live, but also I've heard in general in other parts of the world, regarding the idea of becoming a professional historian, relying on publishing and books, chiefly in articles, and making a career eventually, even just not necessarily for academic teaching, but just for doing it, just for widening your horizons, extending your nets of contacts, and participating to an activity that objectively is fascinating. Many people I know that they are mostly into studying for working, and it may seem somewhat strange to say, you may want to write an article, for example, without having no specific academic ambition, or just for fun, right? But this is an option, telling the truth, and therefore that's also why I talk about this. And I was saying that maybe I'm not the best person to give an advice, because I've written, after all, a few. I've been very, very invested in my work in the recent years. I did all in a row, without separation between the bachelor, master, and the PhD. So I've not looked around much. This is actually a thing that I have, a personal, characterally speaking, let's say, that I fixate on something very, very intensively, and even energically, and sometimes even with a waste of energies, right? Rather than broadening a bit the horizon before, and getting a better depth and perspective, and therefore ultimately also doing things in a more economical way, in the etymological sense of the word. And I've written these articles that I wish I had, to tell the truth, because first of all, after just some time, I think I would have at least corrected them, not heavily but substantially under certain points of view. So I wasn't particularly satisfied by the content, but also because it took me a lot of time, and this is something I would like to stress today, that in order to write something good, it really takes a lot of time, right? And I know people who apparently are, there are way more than apparently actually write extremely refined texts with relatively few preparation, either because they're very cultured people on their own, or naturally this is more likely when they write about something that they already know, that they have been studying for years, however, so they have a solid background and however, it seems rather a matter of intelligence. Like, with my PhD colleagues, I feel very complex because I personally don't feel that I'm so fast, so quick, so smart as they are. They do a great lot, and I do simply sometimes something different. I'm the only one who studies military history, for example. The more I go on, and the more I realize that there is really a great difference between military history and history in general. Right? This is also something I would like to talk about in a dedicated video, because we somewhat get the impression that, after all, military history can be accessed by literally every historian that is able to read about that, and without gaining a military logic, without making a specific exercise of analysis over tactics and strategy with sources and maps, right? And just talking about, today a military historian can be a person that has just studied archive sources about how an army was organized, but having literally no idea of how it worked in the field. And at that point, you really lack the essential, like the most important thing. And there is nothing in terms of war and violence without combat. If you study combat, you can definitely be a polemologist in a sense. You can intertwine knowledge with, political theory, with lots of things, with anthropology, but it's not being a military historian. It's not about studying properly the military art, right? Which is a separated branch that requires a very unique, a very specific studying experience. And that's also why I would like to talk about the PhD when it will be hopefully over for good, because I this is an experience that I feel the need to share for all those who are interested in warfare, as most of you, as you follow Schwerpunkt, that is essentially about military history, are interested in. And the time, right? Time is really everything, right? You can't be smarter or slower like me, but there is a certain amount of time that is this critical mass, is this core around which eventually your understanding substantiates, right? And writing an article is in fact complex, right? It has, for certain reasons, its own rules that are different, for example, from the one of a thesis, right? For example, I began the PhD without having written ever an article, and I wish I still was at that point, because all the time and energy that it took me to write was taken away from my PhD, and it's something I'm very annoyed by, and I wish I had gone back to say, but at least, obviously, it gives also a realization of how certain mechanisms work. In the past, I've been vocal about my deep aversion towards call for papers, right? This system that is spreading essentially as a sort of, a disease, I would say. I know I'm so dark in this regard, but it's really like that. It's really about money, right? It's not become about quality of published papers anymore. It's just about university to gain something in image, or sometimes even properly of money, for these activities they organize, and for young historians, researchers, to essentially have a title more, a line more in their curriculum to prove that they have published something. And in all honesty, since I've been through the thing and I've looked down at what it really is, I remain disgusted, especially not much by the thing in itself, because obviously writing is always good, right? And even having something published in terms of personal achievement and accomplishment can be a positive thing too, right? It is, but the problem is the mechanism that is being triggered with this stuff, for which it's fundamentally more and more published with less and less quality, and also with certain broader problems that are triggered by this, that there is essentially the general loss of understanding towards a more complex view of history. What does this really mean? Well, it's obvious that the more is published, and this is true in the last generations, that there is an astonishing volume of written stuff, right? There is no comparison. When our professors, studied at university, they just had to read essentially a couple of books, first of all, like 2 or 3, and it was mostly literally about books, about monographies, about a great structured, systematic, substantial reflections about history, about that specific topic, and then starting from there to maybe have another approach to expand on another, even in about a smaller topic, and starting therefore what eventually began at this point in history that naturally many more people study in the first place. So in the West, we, generally speaking, at the time, already generation of our parents, I can't say, our grandparents, having just even an elementary education was something relatively precious, right? Having finished high school, for example, was a big deal up to a very few time ago in most Western countries. And secondary education was just for people who, were somewhat privileged in their also socio-economical background, right? It was a very different society, educational systems. Here, I don't want to digress too much, because otherwise but you have to understand even the expectations, the broader dynamics of what is properly now a market, right, of publishing. That the logics of which you must understand if you want to publish something in the first place, and see whether it's worth it or not. So today, obviously, every kid that goes to school, almost every kid that goes to school, at least in the place where I was raised, somewhat offends at the idea of not getting to university, because everybody has to be special, everybody has to be smart, everybody has to be super cool, and nobody has to break. And this triggers in reverse that for those people who actually can't do that, because maybe they can't afford higher education, or they simply feel that they want to do something else, a sense of imagination and resentment, as if not undergoing a higher education was something so dramatic. I personally believe that our societies in the very near future should focus dramatically on the extension, at least, of education. It's not really a problem of anything comparable we've ever seen before, historically speaking. We could talk, in fact, of how education evolved, after World War II in Western countries, what the goals were, what are today, what are the myths, what are the best educational systems. Because most of the people don't even think about that, in fact, in complex terms. It's as if we compartmentalized education in a way and saying, okay, well, what about our politics? What about our society? Well, those do not matter. Let's concentrate on education only. We have to calibrate this on major issues that are not even just socio-economical. In fact, that countries that need more occupation, take Russia for example, they study less years of school, and that's a need because they need labor force, and they don't need hyper-specialized individuals. In Western Europe, it's different, and that's where we get this idea that after all, education is something, secondary education is something highly preferable, highly likely. But even in Western Europe, I tell it from my experience, my ex-girlfriend, for example, I remember she said she was from another country, the major Western European country. She couldn't basically access university in the same way she had basically joined it, because when she had finished middle school, she had to choose which high school to go, and she chose the technical one, and for that prevented her. So the socio-economical educational policy of her country was to say, okay, you are 14, you already at 13, 14, you already decide what you want to do in your life, which obviously no kid at that age knows. And then it's not that she can't go to university, but that's more difficult for her, and this is done for fitting into a market, right? A stable market in that regard, for which there is a pre-arranged destination depending on what you have studied in high school. In the country I am from, for example, if you study technical stuff at high school, you still can't access university. That has also caused some problems. Has caused in some. As a factor, in absolute terms, a lowering of the educational standards that's been, I think, in my country at least, compensated by other qualities that, after all, our academies really are maintaining, but also here for a demographic reason, because the older professors are leaving, that things will also change. So you understand how complicated that is, and how there's not really like a life choice that you can't you can't contextualize so easily in a pre-arranged set of of reality, because this varies a lot. It depends on who you are, where you get educated, who you get educated by, actually. And that's also an important deal. Sometimes there are major differences even within the same countries. Certain regions that are worse education, or maybe certain centers that are kind of more sectarian. There is something like more like an academic mob that is very frequent, actually, in Western Europe, like that, even with substantial economical interests, so how money flow and so on. I think I was lucky enough, after all, compared to a lot of people, actually, to have centered for a combination of places. First of all, my family, because what the support I received from my family has been terrific throughout all my life, but also the place where I was born and raised, the institutes where I studied, the people I've met, right, the interests I chose, the faculty I've chosen, right. I was undecided when I was 18. As you know, I told it many times. I tried as a civilian doctor, as a military doctor, as an economist. I studied a bit of economics too, before landing finally and safely into history. So it's normal also to be a bit disoriented at the beginning, because probably until you don't do something, you can't fully understand how it is. So even videos like this are aimed just at people that really want to be aware, from a person that has seen a bit of it, at least, how the impression is. That this, and giving that, I try always to be as objective as I can, and therefore, even when I get polemical, like I've done at this point with the call for papers thing, is I can tell you that there is a valid reason for it. And especially, I've met another guy that is a great guy that works now at my department. He's substantially older than me, but he went through the similar path I've done, and he, for example, now he is a researcher. Like, it's the first stage of academic teaching, and he stated it openly. And he was a person with lots of publications, like tens and tens. Like, he wrote an astonishing amount of stuff. And he was the first one who said, for example, if you're studying a PhD, or just if you're doing a bachelor or master's, what's the point of wasting time for publishing? It's really a waste of time. Like, all these kids that gets obsessed and pressured about publishing in a compulsory way that is totally unhealthy from a psychological point of view. While, for example, they have something so big as a PhD going on, which is an astonishing thing, right? There is an insane, in fact, rate of depression within PhD students at this point in life. There is anxiety, pressure, constant fear of failure, of not making it, the imposter syndrome. There are also things that I, fortunately, but not at a pathological level, but I went through myself. Those are very fascinating, if anything, just from a moral point of view. They tell you a lot. It's a serious issue. But it's a serious issue not much because of the thing in itself, but because of what society works like in regard to that form of education. Because things could be way simpler than they seem, right? If people just tell you what they actually are, and then you can decide of saying, okay, I don't want, what I want, as this professor now I was telling to you about told. That is, you are at the first year of PhD, and you still haven't published an article on the first class, peer review ranking. Is that a problem? Is such a big deal? You shouldn't give a damn. At the first year of PhD, you should be just, going around, reading books, traveling, researching, visiting archives, widening your mind, not giving a freaking damn about any publishing. Right, this idea that people who publish, for example, publish because they are authoritative. It's a whole load of garbage. And the garbage, the true sense of garbage, is exemplified by the quality of papers. They are utter garbage. They don't say anything. There are entire national historiographies. So this goes beyond, far beyond. It gets to PhDs, to other monographies of any kind that are eventually published, etc., that haven't produced anything decent. We're talking about major Western countries that haven't produced objectively from an historiographical point of view, given the standards that existed up to a few decades ago, anything meaningful. It's a joke. It's just even a way of phrasing things, even a way of writing. It's really, this idea of spending 100 pages for just saying one word that is new, right? And the rest just repeating and quoting. And it's become dramatically easier in many ways because, as we were saying before, it's a bit of a social thing. People now, there are lots of people study. So way more people that publish, that write this stuff. There is much less of that there is much more competition in this regard. That should help theoretically, but also is to be confronted with a reality where there is a very few income. So as a matter of fact, it's even the psychological profiles that emerge from these competitions are kind of strange, right? They're not the person that are very squared, well motivated, that have a solid education behind it. There are people who just got those titles from even debatable institutions, or just because they pay for it. Most PhDs in basically almost all the Western world are basically started by paying, and you can't even present a project that someone else wrote. And the university just takes the money and doesn't give a damn about what you write. There's not a proper selection. Most people say, I was selected to PhD. That's not really like that. Because I personally done what a real selection was, and it was anonymous. There was nothing that people knew who you were, that you could do the thing, and you had to pass just to prove that you had a substantial education behind. That's something you don't find much around. Institutions, especially private institutions, are very shady about the way they use their money. They use their criteria of evaluation. They're just names, right? Just think about just all educational standards today are a fraud in many ways. They're mostly based on proficiency that is calculated on criteria that are put out by the same institution, that even include how you manage money, or if you have enough fountains to drink in the university, things like this, right? That is what is the best university in the world. The best university in the world is the university that produces people that know history well, and most of that, unfortunately, has not automatically to do with what even institution, especially if it's a university, you make people enter, right? That has to do largely from their background, from wherever they come from, what they have done in their life, what's their even private activities. There is a lot in here that cannot be properly measured, right? That there is especially a solid continental European tradition of historiography that is embodied chiefly by France, Germany, Italy, that have maintained a bit this higher standards, that have their own differences, by the way, because they all have a bit of a different way of addressing motives. Especially, I think France and Italy are very good at that, and they're in fact very different traditionally, because they have very different academic traditions compared to some other countries that are also getting kind of more Anglo-Saxon in nature. Right, I personally owe a lot to Anglo-Saxon historiography, because it taught me more than else an unprejudiced way of thinking. But even here, we must be aware of the fact that the economical model that stands behind it is often very unhealthy, and it doesn't help people. There is, for example, an enormous reverence towards, in fact, institutions and names and scholars, right? Typically in the tradition, sources are kind of less important than scholars. Like, scholars are semi-gods that you can't touch. What they actually, just because they have a title, just because they have an appearance, just because they have a name, and not for much else, right? And there is an important way of dealing with education that we don't like to address, right? We are just sponsoring our own countries. We're just saying, oh, look at how cool we are because we are this guys here with this flag here that appear like the people were efficient or able or more intelligent or more advanced, and they produce utter garbage. If you actually go look at the standards of pure scholarization, even just how a person expresses him or herself, they're dramatically disappointing. There is a dramatic ignorance that is rising all over the world, and expressly concerned about the West, because we had actually very good traditions up to a few generations ago. At this point, it's going downhill, right? And I realize it's a historical thing, right? As we pointed out at the beginning, there are all valid reasons, but every time you want to write something, every time you want to even just to learn history, you should wonder in this regard what this is all about, because the myth that the exoteric picture of these professors that who knows what they know, and how cultured they are and how bright and intelligent and sophisticated and open, right, and reliable, right, they are, is often not true. And I can tell you from a perspective of now, from having met really a lot of them and really having read a lot of what they wrote in my field, and how the thing gets to the bottom end of the research on a specific field, and it's not very comforting. It's not really something we should be as complex towards, as long as maintaining, though, that of course if you want to search for anybody who has a higher understanding of history, you can't you should start from seeing from what these people have done, because they're literally the people who know the most about it, right? Then there is an objective, kind of an absolute quality that can swing, but those are still a point of reference, because the other side of this story is that you can't criticize scholar or an entire academy, as we've often done today. Are just they're a bunch essentially of clowns. They're doing politics. Some do. Like, there is an astonishing load of people now that exchanged history for politics and do this, and that's utterly shameful. And that's also part of the reason why the whole, great part of Western historiography is going downhill in this regard. Always maintaining there is something to it that also should be understood, that is not that most people are not willing to accept in general. But in absolute terms, it's obvious that a mass of people is dramatically ignorant and uneducated and incompetent, right? So let's not be, oriented towards this idea, the elites are just a bunch of corrupted, people that, no, they shouldn't be taken as neither as gods nor as devils, right? But for what they are, by understanding the institutions, the communities they represent, etc. And we should be aware, which is something that I tell you every time, that the masses have no utter awareness by the slightest of what history is, right? And so one should be honest in understanding, as I can tell you I don't understand anything about engineering, point. I'm aware of that, but in parallel I can tell you that I wouldn't be surprised if, in the field of engineering, the same thing was true. That is, of course, that those are, in the academy, that's where people know the most of it, or at least engineering has a lot of practical orientation in this regard. Of course, there is a scientificity in there that is studied, that is widened, but of course, just a person that has a title, professor or a PhD or whatever, doesn't mean to be right all the time. Right? That's part of the broader understanding that we need today, that in fact it is an enormous deal to realize, I think, for both sides, right? Because it's obvious that there is a sort of group attitude towards, like, saying, you are down there and we are up here, so we are cool and you're not, right? Or in trying to switch the role in perspectively. But so writing an article is something that, as with any historical work, should be done, because this is what it gets all down to exclusively, and I stress here the adverb exclusively, which means that the rest shouldn't even be thought preventively, for your personal pleasure, right? Every person who pretends to study something just for bread or read money, actually, is a person that will lose something in the way, that will not be as good as the person who will do it by full passion, right? The two things can coexist, because it's obvious that everybody eventually who studies to either keep, to teach or to work with that, does it for a career, for money, for stability, and there is nothing wrong about that. But first and foremost, like, history is not something that requires a level of standards that can be dissociated from the broader philosophy that brings you to study history. Right? You study engineering, you learn how to make bridges. You must have a moral there, just like a doctor should have, or an economist should have, saying, okay, that I must be socially helpful. I have to be socially reliable. My professionalism is what matters for making society going well. But in those fields, like if you're an architect, you learn a set of notions that are extremely complicated, extremely difficult, but that remain those notions. Right, you can add something to it in terms of some, innovation or taste, or vision, or I don't know, talent broadly meant, but there is a kind of a mechanical component to it, right? Then you can develop a sense of your understanding. If you're a doctor, you have to diagnose a pathology that the experience will tell. Every doctor will tell you is crucial, and that's something that you're not taught in your years of medicine until you start properly putting hands on your patients. And the notions, however, that you learn from medicine books are always the same. They're just, this illness, do that. This illness, do that. It's very, very linear in this regard. With history, there is no standing point. And this is therefore something that really deeply makes you reflect about a whole lot of things. First of all, because history, especially if you study it in a broader, complex sense, think about politics, society, war, etc., is something as heavy as the whole history of humanity can be. So every person that wants to write a thesis, an article, a book on whatever, the condition is, whether it is received secondary education or not, whether it has to live with that or not, whether it's an imposition, right? Because sometimes it can be, but most of the times it's actually an opportunity you should be looking for. Well, you should do it for the pleasure of discovery and nothing else, right? Naturally, the pleasure of discovery, and this is another point that we'll have to touch at some point, that doesn't entail that you have to be a mental eunuch, right? You may be doing this for whichever reason. It can be even political. It can be everything. Because let's be honest, what is that makes us curious about history, right? It all starts. We all know it. There is no fiction. Everything is connected to the world, and that's what I was talking about before. Of course, you should maintain certain deontological standards for which if you you have a specific ideological position, and you're obviously, embracing it as a dogma, and you want to sponsor it in a way, well, it's obvious that, and you write, in fact, a text for the sake of it, well, you can be, at least honest enough to admit that that's not going to be an attempt to write something objective, right? I think that the main discriminant between, actually an honestly oriented and honestly hearted person in this regard is, you can have all your beliefs. I have my own beliefs, but I basically never talk about this on Schwerpunkt, or if I have some bias or subjective opinion that is not confirmed, I always say it, like, according to me this may be so because of that, but we should dig more into that to find out And that's properly where the curiosity here, this example shows how it is born, right? So the discriminant there is how truly curious you are to find out something new. If you want to find out something because you hope it's gonna just bring something to support your ideas in an ideological sense, right? Just know that what you're going to do eventually is just cherry picking or even altering reality, so that what you write brings something to your position, which actually, given our historiographical instruments today, is very easy to spot and very easy to debunk. One very easy way to spot objective who doesn't have a true historical competence is firstly methodological, right? Because history is purely a method, right? It's not a science. If not it's properly not. Let's be honest. Science is a broader knowledge and understanding. It's something, but history defines properly the moment of research, and that detachment we're talking about of the masses from qualified historical research is exactly the lack of understanding that derives from having made those steps during the research, right? There are probably logical steps. Being confronted with realities are way more complex than what they appeared at the beginning, and until you don't get through the problem and try to make sense of it, you will not understand. So until you don't do that, you cannot understand that dimension exists. That's why fake news are so successful in many ways. It's not about the literally tricking people in making them understand that is true or that's real, because those people properly, you already know that those people do not understand that, and they do not care to understand it. They just want to be told what the fake news tells them so that they can support their narratives that stem essentially from a very intellectually poor background that doesn't bring any individual pride of any type, and just reveals how sadly flat and primitive these minds are, right? It's just like thinking that you're special, for example, because you're born in one place, because you look in a certain way, or you speak one language, or you literally are a citizenship of one country. That's an accomplishment that only a person that objectively is completely empty at an individual level can take true pride stand, because you could switch that, right? If you were born like simply next to the border, you had been born like 10 kilometers away, you would have simply reasoned in a completely different way, because that's it, right? Your true pride, and in this historical sense, emerges when you start learning things that others don't, and you realize even what it really means to love one place that can be your own, but it can be someone else's, right? You see on Schwerpunkt how many countries I cover regularly, because I believe that the more you study that, and the more you realize truly how much the single ones are worth, right? Comparative analysis are probably one of the single most important ones you can use methodologically speaking, because if you live concentrated in a reality that is all you know, and then you meet something else, it's obviously you know nothing about that. You're legitimately scared about that. The problem is making a person grow without no clue of the existence of the rest, and therefore there's probably a biological time, if before you're 24 years old, where your frontal cortex is not even fully formed, you haven't even acknowledged certain things. For the rest of your life, you will remain at that level. Maybe you will be able to be exposed to some information. Surely you're capable of changing much more than you can actually believe, you're willing to believe. Think about the end of history illusion. But if you wonder where bigotry, how people can support, I don't know, totalitarian regimes, or why they're so fiercely sometimes racist or nationalistic and full of hatred, it's simply because they are empty. They realize that their intellective capacities are limited, and they do not find any better instrument to employ, but primitive feelings, right? And we all have primitive feelings, but the beauty of knowledge is expanding your understanding how to channel them in a profitable way that is also civilized and constructive and rational, and that can help essentially everybody, starting from yourself, to do better. And this is the great value that history has as a medicine for a lot of problems that we have in politics, in society. And there is nothing ideological within it, because it's simply discovering things that we can find out from evidence. It's not a narrative. And when people force a narrative into that, well, that's where there is bad history. And this, unfortunately, as we were saying before, is spreading all the time. So I insist very much on this intellectual honesty, because also here for a methodological reason, because where you're writing something, eventually you will be forced to challenge your preconceptions, right? It happens all the time, and this is beyond ideologism, right? Because when you write something important, you have a thesis mostly, right? An article is a thesis after all, because you have to do it for some reason. You have to specify at the beginning, and therefore that's usually something that is at least planned before, right? It's obvious that at the end of every article, the last thing you write is somewhat the not necessarily introduction per se, but the way you can phrase certain things, because it's obvious that at that point you have found out something important that you have to tell, to present. That's a bit of a trick of the call for papers, that when you participate to them, to an institution, you have to send the abstract before. So this short text in which you have to say in a certain amount of words that they tell you how long it has to be, what you're going to do with that. And most of the time, since this call for paper thing is a frenetic business, as we've seen previously, most of the people send the abstract to be accepted for a conference, or wherever this article is going to be read and published for, have not written the article, right? So there is this kind of strange picture, for which, of course, the most intelligent thing to do is more or less knowing the topics preferentially before, right? So you may usually participate, call for papers, just also for things that you're supposedly an expert on. So you should be knowing a lot before. But the first time you do it, chances are that you really aren't, especially if you're forced to produce these articles immediately, or all of the sudden where you're projected into certain realities. Regarding this, there should be also another, contextualization. It is to say, whether you have been used to write articles, who told you, where did this start during your educational path, because that often happens before, or should happen under someone's guide, right? So this person is usually crucial to tell you, you can't write this, you can't write that. And being under someone's supervision is always useful, especially in the early years, because naturally you don't know enough about yourself, and there's always some expert that, anything for an anographic reason, is older, has studied more than you did. I must say I study things that, strangely enough, are not very studied. So for me it was somewhat easier to cover all, the majority of what had been written in certain cases about the topic, but also to interact with tutors that didn't know much more than I did, and that I already had my own idea, and that's where the curiosity starts. Because I think that the single most important thing when finding out something new, you usually write an article for someone, in the sense that someone is going to read that. You rarely do it for you, unless you're just interested in profit and having that line on your curriculum. So the idea is that you have to come up with something new, right? If someone has already written it, of course, it's useless for you to write, or at least you can read all what that you should have read mandatorily, by good rule, whatever has been written on that. And I say this by rule, not by law, because of course there is no law involved, if not the copyright one, in that regard. but probably because, as we were saying before, the sheer amount of publishing that exists today, historiographically exists, it's cannot be fully covered. Like, I don't know even if PhD researches on certain issues can be even thought or programmed in a way. For the sheer amount, because there are certain topics that would require you to do the whole years of the PhD just to sort out all the bibliography that exists about them, and this is crazy, right? And that also tells you why everything is narrowing down to ever smaller topics, ever smaller details that make the historians worldwide losing completely the awareness about each other. Right, even the interdisciplinarity of topics now has become a thing, right? We should all work together because, after all, we know that everybody can bring its own thing. Yes, but there is also another tendency, that is that basically there is a certain level of specialization for which we just rely on what the expert from that other side of that subject says, and we simply gotta believe him. While I think that the best thing in that regard is to know a lot, actually, as much as you can by yourself about many different things, and then naturally having your own field of specialization, but also being able to dimension other problems simply from how they emerge from the research. And that's that intuition, that vision that, in my opinion, truly enriches the research, because it's what brings on the fore not just a brutal gap filling of some topic that people know is not being covered yet, but it should be properly about, in fact, trying to answer a question, right? To be dubious about something that you can find new things more out, and that it may be that no one else has properly dealt in the way you wanted it done, right? I don't know whether this happens practically or fundamentally for every single research. It obviously happens, but I don't know how influential it was. For my own, for example, it was determinant. Like, it was like probably even decisive, telling the truth, because I touched a problem that was highly conceptual, but also, as a consequence, very practical. Exactly because it was a big thing, right? That people had lost in details, had somewhat lost track of, they had bypassed. After that, maybe someone a couple of generations ago that would say, those are outdated authors, had started prefiguring, and that everybody after him, nobody has really cared too much to expand, right? And this naturally depends on an enormity of factors, including historiographical traditions, what fields are explored, what are not, right? So even in here, there is too often an excessive run towards the thing that is virgin, right? That is fresh, that is new, that nobody has touched, and that therefore you can be the first one of. And in that sense, expanding surely new fields, even just of new expanding the horizons of the same disciplines, and definitely stepping into someone else's field, and surely fueling interdisciplinary approaches that are positive and so on. But at the same time, that's what we're losing in over time, right? Before, professors were used to study a lifetime and to have almost an encyclopedical knowledge. Today, this doesn't exist anymore. And therefore, that synthesis capability that existed before is lost. And that was one of the single most precious gifts of human mind that we could ever have. Human mind is not to be working as a machine that is specialized just in that mechanism, and then you just exercise that over and over and over again. Human brain has this unique capability that no artificial intelligence will ever have, never have the ability of doing, that is making a synthesis, an original synthesis, through intuition. We've seen it through von Clausewitz. It's not about rationality proper. It's about our intuition that naturally works with rationality as well, in pair with that, but it's still something truly unique that we cannot explain. We can't even explain scientifically, but it does work. It's the same thing that makes us learn things without calculating everything about it. And that's how we live our entire lives, and that's what we should enhance, and that can derive only from a prolonged studying, prolonged education, because the more you put in human brain, the more that brain can surprise you for the originality of the thought that is capable of coming up with. And we brutally, violently, and criminally underestimate that. And that's why I also hate so much call for papers that are so humiliating in this regard for any healthy intelligence, in my opinion. But this is maybe a bit too rant. But I felt the need to state this pretty clearly for everybody who wants to undergo this experience, because and I would say that writing an article, right, there are many ways you can write an article. I mean, also, there are specialistic reviews that publish that. You can participate to conferences, right? You can simply try some other way people have it published. I don't know. The more friends you have, the more it's likely to happen in that regard. I have almost no friends, so I don't have the problem, but I don't care either, because I have other channels in that regard. But I would like to stress the importance of the experience per se. Like, you would think, I don't know, you have been a professional that had nothing to do with history for your entire life, but I can tell you, writing an article about history, or just writing an article in general for any other subject, maybe you've never done, is a truly empowering, unique opportunity that everybody has, right? And that it will astonish you how productive, how healthy for your mind can be, right? How much can challenge what you thought you knew, or how important it can be just for having another perspective out there that in fact others may have not looked at. And naturally this happens for those people who already are into something about the topic, right, enough. So I can't make a general statement, like maybe this video would be better called how to write a history article rather than a generic one. And so I will mostly talk to you about the historical thing, since we are on Schwerpunkt and that's what it's all about. And there are normally 3 phases in every important work that you make. The first one is the sources collection. The second one is the analysis of these sources. The third one is writing. Now, this process can take as long as you need. There are people who study tens of years before writing a book. I think the smallest amount of time for writing a decent article, that after all doesn't have to be something monstrously long. It's usually between 30. Even less, actually. It can be 20, 40, 60, even more. So it really depends. Pages, right? And even the tendency is going towards the smallest thing. But there's an ability of doing that. That's what the market we were talking about before also forces you a bit to be, right? The first article I wrote, for example, took me a lot of time, because it was actually much longer than a normal one. And there was a huge work behind that I couldn't fully even write about on that article, because let's say, of course, it would have required a much greater space, right? A much greater time and means, etc. But I would give, for a decently written article, for a properly history, for a proper historians, put it in this way, 3 months, right? Anything that's written less than 3 months is likely going to be garbage, and that's what most likely going to be most of the stuff that is written on multiple occasions, right? And history is very tricky in this regard, because as you know, just we talk about the Middle Ages most of the times, and already for the Middle Ages, the way I presume articles are written varies wildly from within whether it's an early medieval topic or a late medieval one. All right, I wrote basically just about the 13th, the 14th century. And that's a time that is also kind of interesting because, up to the 13th century, there is a somewhat celestial balance between the, in terms of documentation, so that it doesn't require you too much, but there is also maybe not so few. And while for by the 14th century, things start to enlarge dramatically in terms of sources availability. And even here, naturally, there is always the thing of the archive. Like every good medievalist should visit an archive, which I have never done for work. No, I must say that I work even with great historians that have never visited an article. Simply though because they used to study the early medieval ages. I work with some of the greatest specialists of the migration era at some levels, and there's not much of article stuff that there is out there because archives, of an archive sources, because most of them are studied by more specialized figures that also tend to approach other topics most of the times more mechanical, if you want. Think about the existence of codicology or paleography that is the preferential channel for everybody. But by the 14th century, by later times, of course, visiting an archive and finding out a new source is most of the times what brings to make a new article. Now that's something I hate for a number of reasons. First of all, I'm very lazy, so that the subjectivity that is brought on before. Objectively, many historians tell that archive researches can be very bitter experiences in the sense that, of course, we start having a lot complexively, but most of the times, if you search for something, there's not going to be there specifically. I studied mostly, as you know, about warfare, so there are in archives you can find statutes or contracts of mercenaries, mercenary hirings, a lot of interesting documents. Actually, it tells us, it gives us substantial information about certain aspects of warfare, but very often not about the ones I care about. And I'm fortunate in this regard to study tactics, right? And it's obvious that a mercenary contract will not tell you much about tactics, but at best it can't give you, how that unit was composed by, but it will not tell you, for example, how would it be fielded, with the others for combat. There are lots of problems in this regard. Maybe, history of philology or armor in that regard is quite fascinating. As well, but it's also slightly different for what I do because I don't study specifically that. I study specifically tactics, also shifting gradually towards strategy in many ways, and therefore that's a field, that is history of military art, that you will rarely not find an archive source about. Right? Either you find another source, I don't know, a letter about battle that nobody have ever found, then you start relying in battle, but that's pretty rare. Very rare eventuality, you have to be even luckier, and which means you could be spending weeks in an archive for finding literally nothing. Naturally, visiting an archive costs time, money, energy, and that's not very nice, right? And I am totally in love with narrative sources, right? I have centered most of my PhD on narrative sources, which in some countries is like an offense to the divine scholarship, right? It says that so narrative sources, chronicles, blah, what are they? They're all subjective, they're all false. Then you compare them all. You study them all for a huge period. I studied hundreds of them in this research. You compare them, and you find out that these allegedly unreliable chronicles draw, in spite of all of their difference, wherever they wrote them, when, where, say, better, when also in the range of a few decades, of course, but they all give, if you cross all the information, they give a pretty eloquent and actually fully consistent dynamic. They about, in that case, it's really about army's transformations that is confirmed by lots of other different sources in the same exact way, and helps to dimension a reality that, in fact, very few people study, right? Usually, even people who study history of military art, they study just, a bunch of battles, which is fine, right? They are more rarely and compare them, right? About I don't make names, but I have my inspirations for PhD. They don't study campaigns, because who gives a damn about campaigns? Battles are the cool thing, right? If you can't study properly a battle if you study its campaign, and also they separate, in fact, tactics, combat from organics. They rely mostly on this scattered, specific, unorganical, and asystematic, articles written here and there for very different realities, and pointing out lots of details also that are not very comparable, but for the sake of local history, very often that is done, and that doesn't help comparative approaches. And instead, if you're able to widen the thing, even at, just what those people living in those times were simply letting you to know, right? You can't do that with certain times and spaces, simply because if there's not enough narrative sources, all the narrative sources are just paid by a king to sing his deeds, is one thing, right? If there are relatively free authors that in great quantity, and you really want, it's rare, right? I must confess that my field, my research is very peculiar in this regard. It's mostly an exception, more being peculiar in European history, but something new comes up, and I hope one day you will be reading my work, because I hope so much that this will be understood for what it is, really. And I can't say more, but at that point you will even understand who I am. So I don't want to even say too much about what the contents are, but I can assure you that there is a lot still to know about the Middle Ages through certain, mostly comparative approaches that are regularly abandoned in favor, or either they're comparative in those stupid statistical terms, like, let's call 6 historians, let's make them collect a lot of data, and let's use this softwares to find out the great interact. That's garbage, right? That's Sovietic history. that's not history at all, right? Those are the new filmish stuff that they want to make people, in fact, believe there is innovation in universe. No, that calculating history through statistical softwares is like literally raping history as a minor, right? Repeatedly. That's exactly what it is. And the reality here is, once again, the synthesis capability that is faulty in many ways, but with experience can come to really help a dramatic lot. And in practice, writing an article in this regard will as well require you to make some effort of finding new sources, and often doing it in archive. Searching in archive, I think, is funnier than it seems. After all, I think I will have to do it at some point, and consistently, and it's not this huge deal after all. And it's actually very beautiful. I telling you the truth, I did work in an archive. I mean, it was just it was the kind of stage like that was needed for, not for working, but it was an extra. It gave me points for university. Like, instead of making an exam, I spent some days in one place that hosted us. It was a former monastery that had this library attached. Was very interesting, and we took this. It was a codicology class, and we actually a paleography class, and we took this manuscript that we worked in a team of 4, and we described it. It was fascinating. I've met interesting people. It was a beautiful place, by the way, and I finally touched a manuscript. We finally started it, and I did it actually once again, even in my city, fortunately, which is rich in such historical archives, and I did it once again with another manuscript that kind of became my own, because when you start reading, you start counting the pages, how it's built, who has written it, you try to give it a date, you try to find what is written is to be found, and it's an original text or not. It's a beautiful experience, but at the same time, I'm lazy, as we were saying before, and I haven't done it much more, because I really prefer to read my beautiful chronicles from home, and that's what I can. When you find, when you read a source and you over and over again, you always discover something new, right? That's the magics of history. That's what brings you to reconsider everything, right? What really makes you see things from so many different perspectives, and what, after all, these people were writing for you to read. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but you read these 14th century chronicles. It's as if you were talking to a person these days. They had a terrific intelligence. They told you exactly, in many ways, what was important, right? Not the modernistic mechanic thing that we would like to find out, like a fact, right? A hard fact. Look, it's the fact. Hence the obsession for archives and documents, right? Because if it's a document come from an official chancery, that's a useful thing, right? Instead, a chronicle is not, right? That's not a very healthy way of reason. So naturally, there are many ways of finding resources, and I can't explain to you now, if not briefly, how to do it. Sources are obviously everything, and I should make a video about them. I personally chose, at least for my articles, I chose mostly, published stuff. So it was mainly chronicles and articles about general aspects related to the things I was searching for in the chronicles. Most chronicles from the time are actually published. They are even digitalized most of the times. Naturally, banal advice, always try to find the most updated edition for a source, right? That's very important, because in the meanwhile, other manuscripts are found, or there is a better philological inquiry on it, so you can rely on a better text, right? Some texts are discovered eventually to be altered, to be counterfeited. Sometimes there are pieces that you quoted from an older version that do not figure anymore in the new edition, because they turned out to have been later ads or something like this. And so naturally you have the source as such, the original source, and you have a list of historiography that you should always read as much as possible. Like evidence is mostly either, unless there is not a lack of information, especially at the local level of sources that for which you don't have a contemporary source at the time you're studying. Say for the 14th century, you can rely even on later sources that come immediately, 100 years later, 200 years later, locally. There are, I studied 14th century for most of these researches, and there are interesting Renaissance sources that were based on the same medieval chronicles that you study, or even some chronicles that at the time the humanists could access in the libraries, and that now are lost, so that they knew and we do not know. So it's actually very important to listen to those sources, because even if they're later, that you can sort of track basically from what they write, whether if there was something original or not, and the reliability is everything, but the sensitivity towards it is also, you can acquire it over time. There are sources that are evidently not very reliable, also from contemporary times, but every source should be studied for its specific character, for its specific personality. What is beautiful is finding, even in a same literary genre, like a chronicle, for example, all the various differences in narrative style, in topics choice, even in linguistically speaking, if the people spoke the same language, right, that make you understand so much about what the same people were, and this is what mostly philology is about. and that naturally make you understand better the motives for which they wrote. So that's fundamental. You can't take a source just and quote it without knowing what that's fundamentally about. That's a very risky thing. That's like picking stuff from a supermarket shelf. That's not properly history. So you should at least get acquainted. You don't have to become a literary expert about the author or anything, but usually versions of the addition of sources tell you something biographical about these people, who they were, what they wrote, etc. And that's very important. Then there are other collections that you must have to visit libraries for, and there are, things of all types. That they can be correspondences, statutes, other documents of, chancery, or the diplomatic codes, mostly. Some of them are digitalized and are growing. This thing is fortunately growing over time. If your research is properly on a manuscript, I don't know if you're a codicologist or a paleographer, or maybe you're just a historian that goes out with, it's a bit borderline with those disciplines. You want to go out, find a new manuscript? Wow, fine, do it. That point, naturally, there is all a very specific way of addressing the manuscript's characteristics and informations, and that's something very technical. That's why we are taught paleography and codicology for. They are beautiful subjects, and we could even talk about that point. The question is, what kind of every article has a different soul, of course, and a different object, as we have seen. And finding sources proper is not much just a matter of availability, right? You can find them online, you can find them in your library, you can ask your university. There are all these international systems of information share of scanned texts, and so on. So it's relatively easy, at least, to get the source or the study. The point is, in order to write an article, what kind of, how many sources, how on which should the whole thing be based? Well, this largely depends on the topic of the thing. I studied mostly political and military events of certain polities at the end of the 13th, the first half of the 14th century. And I was analyzing them specifically from a military historical point of view, even with some strategic interest. I was studying that with maps for trying to understand how certain cities were controlling their district, how they even the enemies were invading from it. It's all interesting stuff if you see it visioned on a. And that's literally another dimension, right? When you start doing it, there is another dimension that opens in front of your eyes, and nobody can see but you. That's also a very powerful experience, because if nobody has ever done it, it's that that it's something that's been written up is very powerful. Today we have even Google Maps. If you take it, and you obviously being aware, there are studies that talk about this. Whether how the countryside was modified over the years, if there are embankments, dams, other forms of reclamation, the territory changes, but more or less the spaces are the same. So that's of dramatic interest to objectivize, to materialize even speeds for the armies, marches, things like that, and that's what every true historian of military art should be doing. So in that case, for example, I simply started from the chroniclers that are the only ones that tell you the history of those polities in detail. I've checked fundamentally usually in this localistic sense, there are in fact local historiographies that there are a bit of compendium of the history of those places. These things were started being written since the Renaissance in Europe. And they can't go through as well the 17th, the 18th, the 19th century, right? By the 20th century, kind of actually we continued doing it, but mostly on the shoulders of this cultivated style that existed before, integrating it with different um, you know works and historiographical realizations of these times. So all in all, for let's say a city, you will have 2 or 3 books to read just for knowing the essential facts. Yeah, usually that's more of in fact, of an older tradition. In the 21st century, about this kind of works, you will find mostly a synthesis that is detailed and kind of critical and tells you mostly about the social side of the story. The previous historians were kind of more evidential, and that's somewhat very useful if you just want to reconstruct the whole thing. They usually give you immediately also the sources from which information is taken, so you can read the source with this help and gaining further information. And naturally, on the same city there are multiple chronicles, so at that point you should literally be reading all the chronicles for the years that you're taking into consideration. It's kind of easy because especially with digitalization, you can't simply enter a key and find all the. That's tricky because you don't know by which terms certain things will pop out on, especially in older books, on, I don't know, 18th century digitalized versions, 19th century digitalized versions. You may not have the one letter may jump the OCR scan. I don't know what's the thing, but you should study that. For the Middle Ages, most likely there's not going to be a dramatic amount of information. So if the thing happened, I don't know, in 1328, you just look at that other chronicle, see what happened in 1328. It's usually like not even one page, right? So that's interesting. You compare them, you try to trace a line and to make a history of that, and you control the various toponyms. There are many erudition works that really help you with that and to make an original synthesis, and I think that's mostly what I will be doing in the future. My dream is to make a kind of a postdoc with a further with a following, in time of my thesis, essentially continuing for the following 50 years. And but for smaller articles, I think that the single military history and synthesis of these various polities could be an interesting stuff. It's never been done, and the best would be to be helped literally with all you have, right? So gathering the sources is fundamental because you can't arrive at the last minute, as instead everybody does, especially when writing a larger work, and still having to check what a source of the time or even a major work on the topic says. So there is this very important moment of gathering sources, not underestimating the time that this can take. It can literally take one month out of those 3 that we have given ourselves from writing this article. And also maybe asking people around, right? That's very interesting. If you can talk with someone who is already an expert on the topic, can give you some impressions, can help you, and always remaining quite realistic about what a person can know in that regard, right? What is that you really want to know? What is that? Because what happens, especially with people who have an opinion, and that because I have studied for a lot of time a certain topic, right, is that of course they know a lot more, but they may have taken a turn, an interest, a perspective on the issue that may not actually be particularly beneficial to the originality of your work, right? I guess this really depends on the character of the person that is you. Personally, for example, I have never been following anyone. There are people who instead like to follow or even complete someone else's accomplishments. It's fine, right? And need a guide, some people are a bit hybrid in this regard as well. I personally, even to the excess and to my own disadvantage, I've never liked to be guided into towards a direction of research. Like receiving an advice or an impression is important, but most of the times I asked for one. I always came out of that saying this is being basically useless, right? Because the person who was asking but just wanted to sell me their own thing that might have been done in a perfect way, but sometimes it wasn't even about the topic that I wanted to talk about. This is very common. This happened to me a lot of times. That maybe also because, I don't know, maybe I can't express myself properly, but most of the time it's really about the other person, trying to bring the thing down to the thing they want, just behaviorally. I don't know, in the conversation. I don't know why that is, and that should be listened because it teaches you also what other people think like and how easy it's for them to be mistaken. As much as because it's going to be probably the same thing is going to be true for you, for yourself. So you have always to be open and never to renounce. This is at least what methodologically speaking. It's always been a thing of mine. I remember ever since I was a kid, I never I was never satisfied by someone's explanation, right? Even if it was a reliable source, I wanted a book to be more precise about it. I didn't, with children, there's that phase that they start asking everything to their parents repeatedly, right? And I was never, my parents were very patient in general, but I truly wanted to know, and somewhat told me that there was much more to know, and I wanted to to do it on my own, but with my own path, and also to give an impression that I actually developed a sense of my own my autonomous criticism, which is something that is also pretty rare commodity nowadays. So for me, I've never. The first rule is never lying to yourself, like never making yourself pretending that things are in a way that you have no evidence for. And this is valid in life, or in history, as in life, or in any circumstance you can imagine. Right? Many people tend simply to lie to themselves. And lie to themselves is silly because you always know you're doing that. So why, right? And you understand that most of the times it's because of your weaknesses. So history is cool because it doesn't give you any. She's a very harsh master because she shows no sympathy in this regard. She gives you a lot of satisfaction because she shows eventually what the evidence the way it is, and that's what makes you realize what limits of knowing that the whole thing are. It also doesn't give you any room for inventing something that you can't substantiate. So this phase is very important because it's the moment you should be thinking and widening, and of course the collection of sources and studies goes in parallel with taking a lot of notes, right? And there is a temptation that is the one of trying to say, okay, I have these books now, I'll just study sources, then eventually I will complete the information, the text with this bibliography. Once that I will have the skeleton of evidence given by the sources. This is a bit, I mean, it always happens. Like these three phases that we have outlined before basically are always very blended, right? It's obvious that at the end you may be still finding new evidence and analyzing new evidence while you're finishing to write the whole work. It always happens. We're all that messy. We're all that unregulated. But that should help in a healthy manner, in a healthy dose, right? With a healthy dosage for which you don't find everything at the end all of a sudden to reread and to just find out you were mistaken most of the times. Also because nowadays, as we were saying in the beginning, it's rare to find even a topic that someone else hasn't scoped, hasn't studied before, written something about. And chances are this information is way more advanced than yours, especially if you're a beginner, right? So you should never underestimate that. So we can say that the work of analysis of sources and of studies should go in parallel. But the moment of gathering is important, if anything, at the directional level. That is more or less to know, to give you an orientation, to find out how much there is about a certain entity. For example, the other day I was writing about, maybe this is a useless digression, but let's say that I found out that for a specific polity I was studying, for a certain period, I had substantially gotten what had happened in there, but I hadn't passed through the details of the political and social events in parallel to the military ones. And as a consequence, I had skipped actually something that I had foreseen looking at the military side of the story, but that was still slightly different from the one I thought, and that gave me that completion of the picture finally. And I discovered it later, right? But I also phrased that, for example, that reality in a way that now that I know how that our information was about, I know could have been looked upon badly, by an expert, for example, because I would immediately show that about those other issues I hadn't looked much on. So that's very important. Be always aware that someone is going to correct you. So looking at historiography serves exactly to this. Like, it's not just to find an answer for things that you were curious of, but it's sometimes properly directing your aim. Always given that, in my opinion, sources have the precedence over historiography. As we were saying before, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's not like that. Scholarship has a much greater sense of itself, for which that the historiography is more important than the sources in some way. And I'm not very comfortable with that idea, but it's obvious that the things are blended in practice. So once you have gathered all these sources, you can really spend some of the most important phases, like probably the hardest one in terms of sheer psychophysical commitment, because studying actually consumes a lot of calories. It tires your head like crazy, and it's it's something you have to do consistently. It's very hard to do it, even if for a few hours in a row, right? And reason for which it's also important to live in a healthy environment, to not to be stressed out, not to do that just because you have to do it. Give yourself a schedule. You'll say, okay, how much time do I have for doing this? And you give it a fair amount, with a fair amount of reserves as well, for all what you have to do eventually, but also for things that could go wrong in the moment. So you put yourself under that pressure that is acceptable enough to make you do things faster, but also maintaining a qualitative standard of some sort. So the things you should do at that point is looking at all the information you can find on the topic you have chosen, on the object of your article, and it can take a lot, right? And it's mostly important to base your points on the sources rather than on the studies, right? Articles can even be written can be fully historiographical, right? You can make a beautiful article about an historiographical criticism. That is, you read all the books that have been written about a certain topic and say, this scholar thought this, the other scholar thought that, and then you criticize those opinions better on the base of other evidence, and you propose something else. There's a great variety of contents actually in this regard, but most of the articles in this regard is for the kind of topics that I was talking to you that we are exemplifying now, like medieval warfare, 14th century. So for case, it's about, okay, let's come up with something substantially new. Even if it's just an interpretation of a period that we already know, like that military history I was talking about before, but if nobody has ever done it, well, that's, if you do a new thing, it's fine, right? Okay, so it's better at that point naturally to base yourself on the sources, right? If anything, because first of all, it's much easier than they're much easier to substantiate, right? What the source says, that's it. There are no other that you can build your own opinion on it. You can then eventually confrontate it with the historiographical one and come up with something on your own. But it's obvious also for the few amount of information that is generally about that period to to form that kind of structure. And there is this analytical phase that I think immediately goes in parallel with a bit of analysis, right? At least that's how I of criticism, right? Of critique, and even judgment. That is mostly something you should leave for the conclusion, and that should be built on the criticism of the evidence you have analyzed. And it's important because while you do that, you generally have, when you read sources, you generally have impressions that some of which are going to change over time, but that there is a core that usually remains. They can be just, in fact, intuitions or impressions. They're very important, especially in fields like these where we don't have a big deal of evidence. There are a lot of gaps, so you can legitimately speculate about what could keep this together. And it's important to be very objective, and you will be taught that by yourself when you will come back on what you have written. You'll say, what did I write this thing? Because in the meanwhile, what happens is you get an information, your mind, even unconsciously, is going to gravitate around that. So sooner or later, you're going to find a more coherent response for the problems you have raised, and it will make you surpass most of the most of what you previously thought. But never think that first impressions are not important. Actually, first impressions, I can tell you, most of the times are very important. They often exist over time, way more than it's usually the case, because you mostly say at the beginning, well, wow, this is the first thing I got, so there must be something about it after all, something more. And then you'll maybe exposed to that other information, say, no, what I read at the beginning was incomplete. I've changed, I've grown. No, there is other information. Then eventually you look at the thing, and sometimes you go back to the original thing. You discover that it wasn't bad. That actually touched an important point that maybe others hadn't underlined, and you start to make something of it, and that gives you the impression of a truly new thing that you've come up with, right? It's as if it was a fresh, like you found some new gold out of earth, and you want to clean it from all the impurities, and you have it your own. You can't place it, in proper trunk, and that's how it goes with the information you're presented most of the times, and this goes on for a while. There is practically no end, because aside from the writing part, that is also very important to put things in order. It's obvious that this thought keeps evolving, and that's why the written part is one of the single most important and challenging after all. For me, most of what I wrote during the analysis and the criticism is also what will remain over time, right? And then if other information comes about, you try to make further links between one aspect and another. And the written part is mostly already about that, right? There is not properly like a written part that I hadn't already that is completely detached from the work I had done before. I realize some people like to leave things suspended, ideally maybe by method, and then eventually writing down everything later. I was just talking with one of my colleagues recently, and he does like that, for example. And I don't know how he does, because he's one of those smart people that I was talking to you about before, and he's a very fast writer apparently, and his own, I must say, he was criticized at some point by his own tutor for having been speaking with himself during this writing as a style, because he's like that, because he even speaks like that. He even sometimes never gets to the point of the phrase, but he's an extremely intelligent person. For me, I have to be anchored to it's mostly a psychological thing, right? It's not even an intellectual problem of sort. But of course, there is a fatigue there. That once you write things down, you're sure that you have saved them, and you don't have to make your brain make the work for it, remembering again. And you would unavoidably forget certain things. But I also like to give a very like. To make this is important to me, that when I write this, I want to make the reader participating to the historical work I've done, and that's very important because you have to be transparent about everything you write. It goes without saying here, we're not making talking about how you quote, etc. But you should always be extremely clear about everything you write, where you took the information from, sourcing it properly, trying to skip things like quoting an author about, I don't know, a source that you're using, for example, not using directly the source. Like that, you can do that, but it's kind of silly because it looks as if you were really very lazy at the point that you just pasted and copied. It's very easy today to make paste and copy of citations, because everything is digitalized, so you can quote much more easily. Think about how it was before the digital era, right? You had to do it. It would have been impossible even to make certain tests we can do today, because in the past everything was manual or just with a typo. That, however, if you made one mistake and everything was paper, it's terrifying. So we have this huge potential, but we should also be very proper, very very uniform, very standard. Like you should quote even just always in the same way, in a sense, methodologically speaking, so that also the reader gets used to the way you present information, and then you refer to other studies, for example, as a rule, just by order. That's also very important. And naturally, quoting a lot of stuff is good, right? Always being capable of presenting it, how these citations, in a way that you make understand why you quote them, why you even just talk about them without even quoting them, quoting their text, but just saying, I don't know, this author wrote about this. If you're interested in this topic, go look at it. And naturally, a rich bibliography is a good way of presenting a work. Also because the more you quote, and the more the person who is reading is going to be puzzled by all the stuff you're putting out, and therefore says, wait a second, this person knows way more than I do. So sometimes it's even a way of creating the impression, and not really to know everything you have quoted, because it's obviously impossible. I would say smaller articles, as they're usually written today, are easier to digest most of the times. They are also better sourced, so actually a positive aspect of our times is this more schematic method of action. Before, it was more about the thought, the idea, that how the thing unfolded logically. You had to study these very heavy texts that expressed extremely sophisticated thinking that today is fortunately being surpassed. It's mostly a series of facts that are put together nicely, but it's just like a list at the end of the day. And that's a bit, it dumps a bit down the thing, but it also, in the way you write the work, helps you to take something away, inserting another one is actually quite helpful. Then that's why the writing part is important for. That is to harmonize the information, to making it more presentable. I personally like to write in very dry, concise form, right? I even tend to exclude the plurals, right? Let's talk about the reasons of something. I say, let's talk about the reason of, or the motivation, the cause. Well, in that case, there may be multiple reasons, but there is even a certain phraseology that tends to put out plurals to sound more complicated. But what Wu reads doesn't want you to be complicated, right? And this is very important, not just in writing, but in communicating with everyone, to be understandable first and foremost, which is kind of ironic to be said but by me, that I speak very with great difficulty ununderstandable English, but it's in a written form everything is easier to outline on the long run. At least it takes more research. Generally speaking, we write better than we speak, and it's normal, right? And that takes original thinking is very important, right? Sometimes it's very easy to simply copy someone else's phraseologies, right? You just take the same phrase and then you change it. You change it from passive to active, or vice versa. You change some words, and then so nobody can tell you have copied it. But even if theoretically there is a broader intellectual copyright that is about the specific concept, but it's impossible to track at certain levels. Copyright issues are very, very interesting, and we should also make a video about that. There is a general value, naturally, in writing things that are completely original, right? Not just listing stuff or quoting authors, which can be positive. At this moment of my research, for example, I'm quoting a lot of people because that's a way you compliment them, and you you advertise their work, the importance of their. But you have to do it in the right amount, and you should also write something that you generally came up with by yourself, right? After all, people are reading not just for you to quote, to read maybe themselves being quoted by you. You want them to know something more. And that's in fact when the analysis and the criticism of the evidence is of dramatic importance, because that's probably when you come up with something new. Then the rest is just like a side dish, right, that you use to introduce the work to make it more enjoyable, and so on. There is a lot of other aspects. I would say the written part should consider the economy of wording, all the times skipping all the unnecessary expressions. Whenever you can do something in a concise way, in a short way, just do it, because that's the best thing you can do. There was a beautiful quote that I've read last days about being concise, but I don't remember. And before we make some joke, because I'm evidently not a very concise person, but I try always to make points very clearly, right? It doesn't matter whether you write too much, right? You can write as much as you like, even about the length limits. Usually, if your article is going to be published, there are some guidelines and so on, so you can't write a poem. You should be concise properly. But if you're writing something bigger, that can vary wildly in hundreds of pages and so on. It's not important to be concise in that regard. Important is what the quality of what you've written. How many things. What's the specific weight of things you've write. That's extremely important. You can even make a very short text, but that has found out an incredible thing, and everybody would remain amazed by it. Otherwise, it can be something more constructive. But as long as evidence is added, if you're, after all, the thesis is fueled by some point that you're trying to make. So the more evidence you find, the better it is, and you should be happy of it. So there isn't properly any limiting length, except you should always also be coherent. What you write. It's easy to write about a lot of different things, but not and making volume in that regard, but not being particularly incisive in any of them. So there should be a point that you really make. That sometimes is enough, especially if you're writing an article, right? And you can say what you discovered in maybe in another related topic with another one. For example, the things I study, generally speaking, are already being seen by other people. So they're already being pointed out in some other article, or at least they're named, right? So the best thing you can do in that regard is to make a more comprehensive criticism of the whole thing, and therefore a big work can really help a lot in that comparative sense that I was telling you before. In fact, my research is probably a compared study, and that's dramatically useful because I felt as I found out new perspectives of things that people had always talking about, but they had never seen it from the broader perspective, comparing all the elements, right? Starting from maybe there were very well researched works on specific cases, but nobody had seen the thing altogether, so they had lost also a part of the proper judgment on on the bigger, on the smaller issue, right? So this is really and also generalizing. There are many traps that, generalizations usually in our historiography, as you understand, by sheer tendency are not very welcomed. Then there are the traps of reasoning by analogy that are also difficult to, it's easy because that military logic I was talking to you about beginning is properly what we are trying to explain the gaps in what we see in military stuff, and it's risky to do, but at a certain point it's positive, it works, right? As long as you are able, most of the times it's a theory, right? Reasoning by analogy is usually when evidence lacks, right? So obviously you're always guessing, and guessing is fine, right? As long as you're drawing at the theory that you're trying to force down someone's throat just for the sake of saying, okay, look, reality fits the pattern I decided to keep it. Well, most likely it's not gonna be so, but so the general tone of these researches should always be, dubitative, like saying, okay, we don't really know, but let's try to point out certain aspects that can help to clarify the thing. This is usually how historians approach the matter, because it's objectively that difficult, right? And that's why the richness in references and evidence is when you bring them together, especially in the work, is crucial, right? And think about I don't know, the early Middle Ages. It's not that there is really much to study there in terms of evidence, right? But there is an extreme refinement of positions that sometimes take kind of an ideological turn, because it seems to me that it's much easier for someone who comes, studies a much better documented period to say, be aware of ideological interpretations, right? This is, in fact, in history in general, we behave pretty well. I think historians, especially, a little secret, we as medievalists, we think to be the best historians ever, because we have a very interesting compromise between a scarcity of evidence, but at the same time an enough complex society, so we can't get to the bottom of the problems, but still having enough evidence to provide a sophisticated, an actual, base for what we say in a sophisticated sense. So we tend to think that people who come study later periods tend to generalize more, in a way, because they don't have the scarcity of sources, and it's easier with more evidence to simply say, okay, well, it's gone like that, more or less, look here and there, not questioning the broader picture. Then we also think that who comes first is much more ideological, because it's based on, there's just one statement, and then from there maybe an entire historiographical current starts. Sometimes for ancient historians it's like that, right? Thucydides wrote something, and that becomes a topos in ancient historiography. That's true, and the thing is ideologically dramatic, in fact, in fields like prehistory or these ideas of the very origins of mankind, because there is no evidence of so many things about those societies, and therefore people come up with some even bizarre theories. People hate each other. They're too ideologized. They fight continuously, and that's also not very healthy. It's too ideological for my tastes, especially, and my time as well. So because what are you talking about, right? Sometimes. Then send this article to whoever you wanted it to send. Just be aware that it's going to be read, right? So once again, if you're doing it just for doing it, which I hope, we said this first thing you should never do as an advice, it's likely that you're going to write something that is really not good, and that can backfire in terms also of bad review. Not everything that is published is good, and just be aware of that. And I don't know if we could continue, but the video is frankly long, and there are probably many many rings of the chain, many passages that we skipped, like how to frame this broader work. Like historiographically speaking, it's important to naturally state always before what is being written, so that this is also an obvious statement. Like, you should start the article by saying, why am I writing this? You should provide a good reason. You should provide historiographical evidence for saying that what you're talking about has never been written by anyone. Because otherwise, what you're doing it for, and if you're trying to force the other narrative, there are people who can come up and say, this person has already studied that. What are you doing? Where are you updated? It should be always updated to the last year of publishing, and that's difficult to find sometimes. And always there is something popping out that you didn't read, that you had bypassed, or was undergoing printing exactly at that point. It came out the day before you sent the article. There's things like that, and it can happen. And criticism can be very bitter, right? I haven't published a dramatically famous reviews, but I mean the fact that I at least put stuff out there, I'm trackable. I've done that, so I'm done for. But that's a bit the path I chose. So it's your responsibility. That starts with everything. Like, everything you write falls on you, right? And naturally, you grow over time. You change over time. You change opinion, change historiographical opinion. It's very much your to show that you've changed opinion over time, right? There are some historians that kind of re-edit certain positions, that try to look as if they believed one thing before, now they don't. Actually, as if they had never believed them, and that want to re-edit their figures and stuff like that. And it's a bit strange. So the more prudent you are at the beginning, the better it's going to be afterwards. And naturally, everything should be everything is measured on the basis of what you don't know. Like, what you're writing most of the times is about things that do not you do not know fully, right? I can't say it's it's kind of a topos, but the preferable advice is always to be more slightly competent, at least, about what you're writing, or at least to be extremely prudent in every statement that you do. But it's obvious that there is a constant improvement about your work that comes along the way, and it's unavoidably so. And it's probably the thing that matters the most, because that's the true growth, that's the true enrichment. The problem is just to start well. It's to start with the right timing, with the right focus, with the right aim, and it's not always easy, right? It's not always to be given for granted, especially when you're truly and genuinely coming out with something on your own, coming up with something on your own. You should be also careful about what you write, in the sense of, if you discover something new, you'd never be so anxious to put that out unless you know that it's likely that someone is going to do it before you. Even stuffing your work with lots of stuff, lots of intuitions that show how resourceful you are, but also give someone else as a hint can be, a bad strategy if you plan to just sell out your stuff later. But as we were saying before, freedom of expression, even, why should you prevent others also from growing from that thing? But surely it's difficult to project this over time, to say what will the article sound like after some time. At the same time, I think writing less is and better is more profitable than writing a lot and cheaper stuff. So as that's the essential in many ways. For the rest, it's really up to you. It's up to what you think this thing can improve in your life in terms of understanding, awareness of the world. And I think that there is a lot of you can get from an experience like this, even if you do it once in your life, because at least you know what's the potential of it. I know many people who decided to do this simply because they had spent a lifetime, maybe because they were collectionists, or they had this amatorial expertise that also exists. Telling you the truth, people were not professional historians, but had something to say after a lifetime of practice, of experience in similar fields, or they are simply passionate or some way, and that goes right. That is also a viable option, and we will surely come back on the topic and also talking about something slightly more precise in terms at least of the. I think it's very important to see it from a moral point of view, right? To see this not much of a technical thing, because that's something that truly you learn on your own. You can describe how it happens for you in many ways. There's always a tendency to just boast some capabilities that you learned maybe even just recently, and that you want to show to have that you didn't quite have before. That's a heavy path, telling the truth. It can be also very slow, but there is also a specific lifestyle to have in order to become so competent and reliable. And we should talk more about these issues, because as we were saying at the beginning, they can be the base of a new thought on education after all. But we'll have to do it another time. But the moral aspect of this, the motivation is everything, right? And I hope that when I will be done with my research, I will probably describe what this is really a journey, right? And it's not particularly easy, right? At least it's not simple. It doesn't work by itself. It requires an effort that cannot be given for granted, and it's full of dangers as well, because this thing could go wrong, right? And you could have lost years of your life. So don't think it's something so light as saying, that's not important or it's just a waste of time. It's actually very serious in many ways, but we will talk about it on another occasion. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.